I see Doug relit the chalice. The cooler blows it out. So if it blows out again, we'll have to just depend on this larger chalice in the mural. That'll be the one that counts. I want to start out this morning by inviting you to think of the Borderlands not just as a place, but as a state of being. This sermon is about both kinds. The physical borderlands are a place of transition. They can be natural, the transition between one terrain and another, like when you drive toward Mount Hood from the deserts of eastern Oregon. Mount Hood is at around 11,000 feet, not unlike the Sandias, but the land below it is closer to sea level, and so it feels twice as tall. As you approach it from the flat desert lands of the east, it gets taller and taller, looming higher and higher above you. As you get closer, the landscape starts to change, dotted with greener and taller shrubs and more of them, until just when you feel like the mountain's about to be right on top of you, you find yourself in a tunnel of evergreens, a deep, dark forest, and the mountain disappears for a while. You've gone from one terrain to another through natural borderlands. Physical borderlands can also be human-made, like the line between nations. That's the kind we think of most these days, especially here in the Southwest. That's supposed to be a clean line, right? We can see where it is on the map. On our nation's southern border, there's a fence marking it off. There are official armed guards, unofficial armed guards, checkpoints, helicopter surveillance. It's harder to cross that line. It's even deadly for some. Thousands have died trying in recent years, and 2010 was the worst year for deaths. It seems like a clean line, but there's one heck of a mess down there. And of course, where there's no fence, there's no visible line at all, except maybe for a river. And anyone whose roots go way back in the Southwest, or anybody who does a little historical research or even just drives down to the border, knows that the border is actually a much more ambiguous place than the map and the fence suggest. If you approach our nation's southern border starting out in, say, Idaho, you notice that there are changes as you progress south. The farther you go, the more the homes, the signs, terrain, language, and even the music on the public radio station all start to look and sound more like Mexico. There are differences, to be sure, but to the average observer, the Spanish and native influence north and south of the border appear to be of a piece. They reflect a time before the border, when the lands were one. I was amazed when I arrived in New Mexico and learned that there are two official languages here, Spanish and English, a welcome sign that we are in the borderlands. I'm told border towns on the Mexican side are different from the rest of Mexico, too. You've got to go further south to get to the real Mexico, a Latina friend told me, which suggests that on both sides, the borderlands are a place where the border line both exerts its influence and is at the same time disconnected from the culture and the landscape that it divides. It exerts its influence by blocking or impeding the flow of bodies back and forth, but it's disconnected from the flow of culture and language that have a life and history of their own. There are families whose lineage extends way further back in time than the border does, whose family members were divided from each other when it was drawn less than 200 years ago, and who crossed the border to see each other. And there are native peoples whose land and communities are cut through by the border, who for generations have passed freely back and forth across it, but who lately have a harder time with that because of the militarization of that area and the demand for paperwork proving which side you belong to and your right to cross. Human-made, physical borderlands, clear on a map, more ambiguous in nature and in human lives, depending on whom you ask. In 2007, I took a class with the anthropologists David Carrasco and Michael Jackson. Jackson is a slight man, thin and white, with gray hair and a New Zealand accent. Nevertheless, he clarified on student orientation day that he was the ethnographer and not the singer. Carrasco is Mexican-American and has long hair and looks like he could be riding a Harley-Davidson alongside my dad. You haven't met my dad yet. He has a really cool eagle tattoo on his arm. But Carrasco may be familiar to some of you. He has spent time in New Mexico and other parts of the Southwest thinking and speaking about the borderlands. He describes the borderlands as a vexed and ambiguous zone that is not just geographic, but is existential as well. The borderlands is a place of shock culture, says Jackson, where migrants find themselves at the limits of what they can endure. Border Patrol agents are stretched beyond the limits of what they can control. And intellectuals find that the orthodox ways of describing and analyzing the world do not do justice to the experiences involved. Jackson and Carrasco draw on the work of Gloria Anzaldúa, who was a leading scholar of Chicano cultural theory and queer theory before she died in 2004. She's most famous for her book called Borderlands, La Frontera, which is the same name, by the way, as the class. In it, she writes half in poetry, half prose, half history, half autobiography. The U.S.-Mexican border es una herida abierta, where the third world grates against the first and bleeds, she says. A 1,950-mile-long open wound, dividing a pueblo, a culture, running down the length of my body, staking fence rods in my flesh, splits me, me raja, me raja. This is my home, this thin edge of barbed wire. I don't know if she believed that there should be no international boundaries or no fences, but she wrote frankly about the effect ours had on her. Her people's history, her history, was on both sides of the border, physically and existentially. She was, she said, Chicana, Latina, feminist, queer, a woman of color, and all of these groups claimed her allegiance and had it, as did the third world and art and literature and academia and more. And crossing between and among all of these identities, all of these sides of herself, she said, was like living in the borderlands. She extended the concept of borderlands to relate to any time a person struggles with not fitting into one category. She was everything. And because she was everything, she was uncategorizable and could have been swept aside as nothing if she hadn't found her voice. Like physical borderlands, borderlands as a state of being has to do with border lines that are clearer on paper than in practice. When I first arrived in Albuquerque last summer and took my son into his new school to register him, we had a really interesting borderlands experience, an experience of not fitting into one category or another. I was filling out the paperwork with his name, age, gender, all straightforward in our case. And when I got to the race box, I left it blank. I turned the paperwork into the staff person and waited. "Oops, you missed a box," she said. "I left that one blank," I told her. "We have to have something there or the district will send it back to me as incomplete," she replied. I looked at the categories. If I checked white, it would not account for my son's Hispanic heritage. If I checked Hispanic, where did his white, non-Hispanic mother fit in? And wait a second, Hispanic is not a race anyway, it's an ethnicity. More on that in a minute. But most people think of it as a race, and if it were a race, then according to the one-drop rule, which says if you're even a little bit not white, then you are not white, that would be the right box. But as the mother of two multiracial kids, one of whom has dark skin and dark eyes and dark hair, while the other has light skin and light eyes and light hair, I've never thought much of the one-drop rule. And if I marked other, wouldn't that be the same as saying neither? I could check too, I said. Even that seemed questionable since my son's father has Spanish, Italian, and indigenous South American blood. You can only check one. I don't know which one to mark, I told her. Just pick one, she said. It doesn't make a difference anyway. She meant to the school, of course. Now, this staff member is one of my favorite people at my son's school, and I didn't want to exasperate her, but I was uncomfortable choosing a race box for my son, who, by the way, has told me that he himself is undeclared. And so I invited her to just pick one. I handed the form and the problem back to the school. I don't think there was any malintent in the district's question. It was just an impractical one from the lived perspective, the off-the-page perspective. White is pretty straightforward for most people. It's the invisible race. Most of the time you don't notice it, but when you do, you know it when you see it, at least most of the time. That's because of that old one-drop rule. But it only applies to whites. All of the other boxes, harder to apply. The rules get fuzzy. Not that people haven't tried to straighten it out. Spanish colonizers in Mexico, which in their time included the land that we are on right now, were obsessed with maintaining their dominance over society by categorizing and dividing people along racial lines. There's an 18th century painting called Las Castas, or the mixed races, laying out 16 possible combinations of Spaniard, Native American, and African descent. Soon, over 100 categories had been devised, but the new races kept mixing and creating more new races. And the more the groups mixed, the more afraid the Spaniards were that the oppressed groups would combine and revolt. Spaniards back in Spain began to regard the new colony as out of control, inferior, and dirty because of the colonizers' inability to keep the races separate. The new combinations kept defying their definitions. That's why Hispanic today is an ethnicity, not a race. And of course, the whole system eventually collapses in on itself, becoming applicable only in the quote-unquote pure cases, and we know where that kind of thinking leads. Race is a really misleading idea. It's probably still necessary for describing human experience to some extent, but it so quickly becomes inadequate. There are other identity boxes that are the same way: gender, sexual preference, even religion. That's what's great about Unitarian Universalism. Many people have a hard time understanding what it is because it's a borderlands kind of religion where many things come together. And like the border, the orthodox ways of describing and analyzing do not do justice to the experiences involved. But here's the good news. According to Michael Jackson, the anthropologist now, not the singer, the borderlands are the optimal location for enlightenment. It is at the limits of what we can say or do, he says, the limits of our knowledge, where we come into our own as human beings. It's when we are stretched to the breaking point and lost to the world that we come the closest to what some call the nature of things, others call our humanity, and others the divine. The limit is therefore a threshold. He goes a little further. Real understanding, he says, is usually the result of enforced displacement, of crises that wrench a person out of his or her habitual routines of thought and behavior, rather than a product of philosophical choice or idle curiosity. Maybe this is starting to resonate with something you've experienced in your own life. An experience that took you to your limits, the brink, a threshold. Or maybe you long for such an experience. Jackson is especially talking about encounters between people or groups of people that force us to realize that our identities are not fixed things that we are born with, but are the product of the time and the location into which we are born. Born into or thrown into, to use the philosophical term. Thrown carries that sense of randomness. Identities are especially the product of the relationships that form us. We learn how to be human from one another, and we keep learning it throughout our whole lives. Meaningful encounters with people who are different from us, if we fully accept them as equals, will challenge our very identities. Desmond Tutu speaks of the African concept of Ubuntu. Now, I know that the tech geeks among us think Ubuntu is a Linux operating system. I see you perking up out there. First you were surprised that I said Ubuntu, and now you're surprised that I know about the Linux thing. But it's more than that. One translation of the African concept of Ubuntu is, I am because you are. Another is, I am what I am because of who we all are. It's partly because our identities are tied up in our neighbors that in our country, race and immigration have long been the challenges that push us as a nation to our brink. I remember a letter to the editor that was published in my town's newspaper when I was a teen. The writer was responding to a local farmer's plan to build housing on his land for the migrant workers that worked for him. This neighbor was opposed. The reason, as he put it, was that he didn't want a bunch of Mexicans stirring up dirt on the road and living in crowded rooms. He put it as though overcrowding were the Mexican way and not a reflection of how adequately the farmer provided for his employees. He was not suggesting that the farmer provide adequate housing. He was just saying, stay away. I'll tell you what, the physical border is a place that extends into the souls of the people whose history transcends it. And due to our dysfunctional immigration system, the ambiguity and danger and lostness of the borderlands extends up into this country, stretching from corner to corner. And while the rest of us who experience borderland identities are able to speak up, challenge others, try to come up with a new language that can make us known to others, within immigration's borderland state is a class of people who exist as invisibly as they can. Some of our town's migrant workers were my friends and neighbors. I observed their scrimping and pinching to get by on a farm worker's pay and still have some money left over to send home so that sons and daughters could eat and get an education and break the cycle, or so elderly parents could get by for another month. And I saw how, in their desperation to be able to do these things, they tried not to stir up anything. They tried to fly below the radar. There was too much at stake if they got caught. They were here and not here. These borderlands are the state of being kind, the kind that have to do with the border lines that are clearer on paper than in practice. Legal and not legal are clear borderlines on paper, but in practice, they beg the question of what is right and how to respond. And then we quickly realize they're insufficient. Our reading this morning was about a baby being born into that liminal space, the space between. He was born into a time and location that gave him American citizenship, but he will learn to be a person from invisible people. If he's like many other children of undocumented immigrants, he and his parents may never have an open conversation about this, or about what will happen to him if his parents are pulled over for a minor traffic violation and suddenly deported. He will live in unstable borderlands, far north of the physical border. He was born in Oregon. unless things change. I haven't proposed a plan for immigration reform this morning, although I know some of you were hoping I would. For the time being, I leave it to our immigration action teams to work on responses and solutions to immigration chaos, as Christine called it. They're doing an excellent job and are moving ahead with plans of action that I really think will make a difference, and I hope also inspire you to get involved, whether it's in big ways or small ones. We have 3 teams tackling immigration from 3 angles: legislative, hands-on, and educational. Our legislative team is meeting with local officials and partnering with allies in the community. When we ask leaders of other organizations like El Centro, Partnership for Community Action, and Somos un Pueblo Unido, what a congregation like ours can do to make a difference, the thing that we hear over and over again is, speak up. Our lawmakers need to hear from not just immigrants, but everyone. The legislative team has taken this request to heart and is getting ready for the special legislative session in September. They want to make it easy for all of you to tell our legislators that we want humane, rational reforms, not counterproductive or Arizona-like laws that increase chaos and suffering while forcing the issue. This team is changing the rules that make the immigration borderlands state of being so prevalent in the country. Our hands-on team is collaborating with the ACLU with the idea of giving Know Your Rights workshops to immigrants in detention centers. And they're in conversation with our ESL program here at First Unitarian, exploring a possible collaboration. I can't wait to see what they come up with. They are allies to people in the borderlands, helping their inherent worth and dignity be seen and respected. And the education team is helping us all to continue learning about immigration. They're planning field trips to the border, including a possible tour with the El Paso Border Patrol. This team is helping us see the borderlands with clear eyes. Stay tuned. So while these groups are working away on plans, a way forward, what this morning has been about is spiritual depth for the journey. It's about the depth aspect of our call to social justice, because without that, we quickly burn out. There are 2 ways to get at the spiritual or depth aspect. One is through reflection. That's what we do most Sunday mornings. Ritual is a part of our reflection that deepens it to subconscious, non-rational levels, the heart level. The other way is relational. I am because you are. If we're doing social justice right, relationships are formed in the process of taking action, and not just with each other or with the underdogs, but with all of the players. In a play on the poetry of Antonio Machado, Gloria Anzaldúa says, "Caminante no hay puentes, se hace puentes al andar." Traveler, there are no bridges. You make the bridges by walking. Sometimes the mess and the mystery of the world can feel overwhelming, the problems unsolvable. We're going to close with one of my favorite hymns, one that is a balm for my spirit when the work feels heavy. I hope it gives a lightness to your spirit too. Please rise, you know how I mean, and sing "My Life Flows On" in endless song. What number is that, Doug?